Thank you very much, Barry, and thank you for those very warm words of introduction, and also about Chatham House. I'm very fortunate. I think I've got one of the best jobs actually in the world, leading Chatham House, but I'm conscious that there are a number of institutions now rising, as they should be, in Southeast Asia and Singapore and elsewhere, with whom we now have the opportunity to partner and to be able to think a little bit more creatively about where the world is going. And I'm delighted to have this opportunity to speak here as part of your lecture series with RSIS, the Rajaratnam School of International Studies. And thank you very much for coming at relatively short notice as well to come and hear my thoughts and hopefully share yours with me when we get to the Q&A. So, we've laid out here, or I've laid out, I suppose, a question for the transatlantic relationship. I thought I'd better stick to things that I have some knowledge about and some comfort on in terms of US-European relations, having, as Barry Deska said, worked at CSIS for some 10 years, half of them running the Europe program there, trying to explain Europe to Americans. I now spend a lot of my time trying to explain America to Europeans in return. So I'm going to triangulate that a little bit here in Singapore with you today and ask whether the transatlantic relationship is at a moment of renaissance, stuck a little bit in a sort of drifting period after the end of the Cold War, or running the risk of separating further apart. And if I could just say to open up, the transatlantic alliance has probably been the defining alliance of the 20th century. It's hard to forget how long this alliance, which has manifested itself both in economic as well as in military realms, has held itself together, not only through the period of the Cold War, which gave it its animating purpose, but also through the period after the end of the Cold War, where it has still hung itself together around some new concepts. I suppose the question for the future is whether it can sustain that sense of animating purpose into the beginning of the 21st century. And on the one hand, as my title implies, I think there is still a shared sense of purpose, and I'll talk about that in a minute. United States and Europe are still a shared community of values, of culture, of economic development, even of interests, and do consider themselves allies in an uncertain world. On the other hand, I think despite all of the positive rhetoric around the transatlantic relationship, there has been an element of apathy that's come in since the end of the Cold War, and efforts at redefining the transatlantic relationship have proved to be very difficult, and I'll discuss those in a minute. And I suppose the question is, can the United States and Europe rediscover a sort of organizing principle? Why? Yes, why should we work together other than just for the purpose of history? And if we don't have a sense of purpose, will apathy dominate? Or even if those moments of apathy go and we discover purpose, will we have the structures, the infrastructure, the institutions, and the resources to be able to act together? So I'll break my remarks into three pieces: purpose, apathy, choices, and then be very much welcoming taking questions from you. When I worked at CSIS in Washington, I remember 2005, nearly 10 years ago, I set up a thing called the Initiative for a Renewed Transatlantic Initiative, for a renewed transatlantic partnership. And the thinking there very much was that you could rebuild the US-European relationship around a global agenda. Now, that once the end of the Cold War had come through, the idea that America would need to protect Europe was clearly not going to be a sufficient organizing principle for the Atlantic relationship. And the big effort was, how could we look out together at challenges that we faced in common? And I think we were both invested in the world order at that time, dominating the UN Security Council in terms of permanent members, playing a leadership role in the World Trade Organization, in the IMF, in the G7/G8. And ultimately there was a kind of positive as well as somewhat of a defensive relationship and reason to try to reinvigorate this transatlantic relationship. And let me give you the two main driving forces as I saw them on the positive side and the one on the defensive. On the positive side, I think the relationship right now is thinking about how to sustain open, liberal markets So it is very much an economic agenda. I think we need to remember that the transatlantic economic relationship is one of the deepest in the world. Bilateral trade of about $750 billion, but more importantly, the sales of subsidiaries of each other's companies that have built up their net and web of investments over a long period, now are some 3 times the level of the bilateral trade. So it's an incredibly deep relationship, and it's reflected the effort to try to make sure that this would continue to constitute one of the key dynamics of the relationship after the Cold War, has been demonstrated in a series of efforts to launch some type of transatlantic free trade area. It then became a transatlantic economic partnership, and it has finally emerged in the last year into the concept of a transatlantic trade and investment partnership, or TTIP, as many of you here, I'm sure, will be aware of. I mean, the logic for trying to make trade, and in particular this idea of deepening the relationships behind the border on non-tariff barriers to trade and investment, this has been driven very much by the idea that both the United States and Europe have emerged from a very difficult period of economic crisis to try and find a new way to be able to drive growth without having to rely as much on credit as they did in that period of the 1990s and certainly into the 2000s. By any sort of measures, being able to build up a TTIP, a Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, could push forward quite extensively the dynamism of the transatlantic market in a number of areas, particularly trying to drive growth potentially if you were able to reduce these non-tariff barriers by some 50%, or 30% or 40% from what they are today. You could see a growth of roughly 1% of GDP per year on each side of the Atlantic. It's also an opportunity to a certain extent to hedge against China's rise and to make sure that the kind of standards and regulations that have been built up over the years in the United States and the EU, by being sort of coalesced and brought together and mutually recognized across the Atlantic, they may provide a sort of infrastructure of transparency, of rule of law around aspects of trade in the digital market, in chemicals markets, in agricultural markets, that might serve as standards for the world as a whole. And ultimately, it would give, therefore, the transatlantic relationship a sense of purpose and a sense of mission beyond this period at the end of the Cold War. And I suppose make up for the fact that Europe and America's strength as leaders within organizations such as the WTO and ultimately in the IMF are probably going to decline in the coming years. So there's an element of urgency, an element of desire to move quickly that's important and has really come to the fore in the last couple of years. I suppose the second big driver of a strong transatlantic relationship, a sort of positive agenda for today, is still the idea of supporting democratic societies as they emerge around the world. Governments both in Europe and in Washington, I think, have traditionally, whether it be right or left, Democrat or Republican, believed that the spread of democratic societies offers the best opportunity for peaceful and sustainable economic growth and for peaceful and sustainable relations in international affairs at any time. So it means there's a kind of instinctive effort always to coordinate whenever they can on democratic political transitions, whether these be in Eastern Europe, and we're now seeing it in the sort of somewhat mixed and complex response to developments in Ukraine. It's been seen in the effort to try to be involved in the post-Arab uprisings, that period after 2011. It's reflected in the sort of involvement or engagement, some might say meddling, in what's taking place in Turkey. And I suppose it goes all the way through to Myanmar as well in Southeast Asia and various transitions taking place in sub-Saharan Africa. In all of these cases, there's a sort of instinctive effort by European governments and the United States to try to coalesce behind democratic transitions whenever they happen. A sense that perhaps world order has hit a sort of tipping point where the idea of these transitions may or may not succeed. If they don't, a sense that the United States and Europe may find themselves yet in some sort of a minority in a more complex set of representative governments or accountable governments that don't reflect quite the democratic approaches that the United States and Europe have pushed. The third aspect I mentioned was defensive. And I think ever since the end of the Cold War, there's been a growing fear that alongside the complex transitions that have been brought about by globalization has been the emergence of failed states, that parts of the world are becoming ungovernable, and that those parts that are ungovernable become especially threatening to the United States and to countries of the European Union. We've seen this obviously in the spread of terrorism, manifested most obviously in the attacks of September 11th, 2001, but also the fear over the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And it means we have deep US and EU coordination whenever we fear that a state may descend into some type of anarchy or failed structure, whether it be in Libya, efforts which have not been particularly obviously successful so far in Syria, but the heavy and constant engagement on Iran, the planning for a post-2014 Afghanistan, and even engagement in the Sahel, Sudan, anti-piracy operations. In each of these areas, on the trade agenda, on the, let's call it, democracy deepening or promotion agenda, and in this defensive space of trying to limit the spread of ungovernable areas around the world and the threats that come with them, whether it be in the space of terrorism, proliferation, organized crime. You know, we've managed to maintain somewhat of a strong transatlantic relationship since the end of the Cold War. So that's, to me, the kind of framework for the transatlantic relationship since, let's say, 2001, 2002. But what's not been working? What are the drivers of apathy? Why have things drifted? And certainly I believe they've drifted, and I've written about them drifting. I think there are four main problems facing governments in the United States in Europe. Obviously, the first is the one that you know particularly well, and I don't need to spend much time on it because you live it, which is this rebalancing of US foreign policy and attention to Asia. Even in London these days, a lot of people say, well, is it really happening? Is this just rhetoric? Or has there really been, or is there really going to be a rebalance? And people compare and contrast the fairly active diplomacy under Secretary Hillary Clinton with, let's say, the slightly more absent presence or non-presence of the US administration in the second Obama term. But it strikes me as an observer of this from a distance that this is a structural change that will be hard to go back on given the demographic changes taking place throughout Asia, in particular the rise of an ever more affluent, demanding and prosperous middle class, the rise in defense budgets that accompany the greater economic growth in this part of the world, its importance within energy markets. And obviously, the United States not only has a growing economic stake, as Europe does, in this Asian rebalance, or this Asian growth. The US, as you well know, is particularly embedded in the relatively bilateral kind of security arrangements that exist in this region. The absence of a institutional security order of the sort we have in Europe makes Asia that much more important for the United States to really consciously make an effort to engage in. So I think whatever ups and downs we see from a first or a second term President Obama to whoever might follow him after the next presidential election, this is a structural and secular shift which is going to continue. And I think equally secularly and structurally, the Europeans are not going to be involved. You know, our relationship is principally commercial with this part of the world. Even the UK, with its, we were discussing earlier, with its 5 power agreement commitments, remains remarkably unattached to this part of the world. We depend, if anything, on Asia as the most stable place it can possibly be economically, rather than in any other type of shape at the moment. And if you think of the UK in particular, which has traditionally been quite a leader, one might think, of a more ambitious European security policy, including globally, it's remained very leery about getting itself pulled into any sort of securitization of the debate over Asia. And having participated in some of these discussions in London myself, I'm struck that I say there would be a minority of people who believe even UK security policy should be taking the security situation in East Asia as an organizing principle for British defense investments going forward. We're more interested in making sure that we are the first or second, it now turns out, kind of renminbi clearing market in Europe, or that we can make sure that China keeps investing heavily into our somewhat dilapidated infrastructure. So second point that's leading to the sort of fraying or aspect of apathy is that what's happening in the Middle East is actually pulling us somewhat in opposite directions as well. The rebalancing of US foreign policy, of course, has not been away from Europe. It's meant to be away from the Middle East. Yeah? The idea that America, from Obama's point of view, is putting far too much effort, diplomatically, resources, blood, treasure, people, into a part of the world that ultimately wasn't going to deliver much positive in return. And so we've seen a US administration that has ended up with some very frustrated and almost dysfunctional relationships with its traditional allies, whether it be Egypt or Saudi Arabia, that's become very selective in its Middle East engagement. On Iran, yes. Syria, no. Middle East peace process, we'll see. I think that's open to debate. On the other hand, you've got a Europe that is increasingly worried about its neighborhood. Its southern neighborhood is a direct source of concern. We've seen a divergence in approaches over the Arab-Israel conflict, with even Britain and Germany becoming much more active in their frustration over the sort of emergent, almost single-state solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And ultimately, it'll be Europe that sees Syrian jihadi fighters coming back into our countries, to our cities, in ways that will be quite different to the US. Although Europe has not been a big pusher, there is a sense of difference in priority and in emphasis between an America that's trying to find a way to detach itself, I would say, as much as possible from the Middle East, and a Europe that, like it or not, is going to get sucked much more into it in a sort of neighborhood way. Ultimately, the next point I want to make is that it's proved very difficult for the United States and Europe to adapt their security structures to the post-9/11 world. And what do I mean by this? The Snowden affair, yes? The whole business of this exposure, of the extent to which there's been this sort of industrial scale spying and or surveillance of non-US citizens as part of the effort by the United States to protect themselves against future security risks. I've been at numerous conferences in recent months where American officials, some of them senior in the CIA and so on, have said to explain, look, don't you understand? It was inevitable that at the end of the Cold War, once we had this, discovered that the new threat was emerging not from massed tanks and missiles flying over the tops of borders, but from the flow of data that swims alongside the data that we use as individuals privately. Inevitably, America's security infrastructure was going to move from trying to track radar signals to tracking megabytes and data. Yeah? And we're doing it for all of us. Yeah? We're helping you in Britain or in Germany or in France protect yourselves against this new threat. And ultimately, the resources that we as Americans have invested into this process is for the good of everyone, good for the good of America and the good of Europe. And there's this kind of exasperated tone that comes from many Americans when they try to explain this to their European counterparts. But it's always struck me when they have this conversation that they're missing something. You know, when Europe and America decided whether you would deploy cruise missiles or intermediate range nuclear missiles, or we decided upon the extent to which Germany might be the front line or not the front line of some big attack by the Soviet forces in the Cold War, this was debated. It was debated publicly and openly. There were protests in Germany. We had a campaign for nuclear disarmament in Britain. Governments rose and fell sometimes on these debates. There's been no debate between America and Europe over the intelligence-led war on terror aspect that was developed initially by the Bush administration and then was continued under the Obama administration. And so when we talk about trust having been eroded across the Atlantic by the Snowden affair, it's not just the trust that you're looking at my data. It's that we never discussed what the nature of this new deterrence would be. We never had an opportunity to explain it to our publics. And now we're having to do it on the back foot. And it really has had a damaging effect. The third element which has led to this sort of apathy and this drift is obviously the baggage of Iraq and Afghanistan. Both the United States and European governments and publics are tired of intervention. Yeah? These have been bad experiences for both of us on balance. But in a way, we're drawing slightly different lessons from them. The United States is working out how it can still sustain a form of forward defense, yeah, which America learned after being dragged into the First World War and the Second World War, that it was that much better for the United States to be involved early and forward, if you possibly could, and avoid the risk of conflict coming to your shores, as they did actually in 9/11. Better to be attacking al-Qaeda in Afghanistan than to be having to deal with them in Detroit. And so the US remains focused on what some people now call this sort of offshore balancing, a forward deployed but detached form of military intervention. And it's invested in the military capabilities, the drones, the bases, whether it be in the first island chain or the second island chain off China, whether it be in some of the new AFRICOM, Africa Command capabilities near the Sahel. The United States still thinks of that sort of kinetic, as they call it, response to security threats, but as far away from its shores as possible. Whereas I say Europeans, and I'd include the UK in my Europeans, are pretty much skeptical of all intervention, of military intervention as any type of value at this stage. To see the kind of debate that took place in the UK over whether to have the right to use military force in Syria, I thought was a classic example. I remember listening on the Today program, which is this sort of everyone listens to it, radio program on the BBC every morning. A former admiral, Admiral West, who was in the Gordon Brown government, but he was interviewed as to why he was so against any type of British intervention in Syria. And he said, "This is my chance to vote the way I think I should vote, as I wasn't allowed to vote when I was in the military over Iraq. Yeah? So I wanted to say no to Iraq, but I couldn't, so I'm going to say no to Syria." I mean, it's pointless. Sorry, I think I've said this publicly before, but I don't know if this is public or Chatham House rule, but it doesn't matter. You know, seriously, I mean, here we are in a situation on Iraq where the UK, in essence, followed America into an American-led concept of why Iraq was an important part of the post-9/11 security structure. In the case of Syria, it was David Cameron, our Prime Minister, who was trying to, G up President Obama to take a more aggressive role in Syria. Completely the opposite situation. And Syria, a near neighbor where we're likely in the UK and other parts of Europe, as I said earlier, to take the consequences of further chaos, not America. It's a completely different case. But for most Brits, the two things just get stuck together in one's mind. Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, it's all part of the same failed kind of approach. And even when we see the Munich Security Conference this year, the German President Gauck, gave a very forward-leaning speech about how Germany had to be more actively engaged in security operations. And everyone at the Munich Security Conference said, "This is fantastic. Germany's coming out of its shell. It's going to be more involved." Opinion polls were taken after the speech. 25, 30% support maybe for the president's speech. Very little popular appetite for the kind of forward-leaning approach that he laid out there. And the reality is reflective in our budgets. I think it's Antonio Misiroli who came up with this wonderful phrase that Europe is ending up with lots of bonsai armies. Yes, you know, perfectly formed but minuscule little sort of trees of military capability. The last point I want to make about the drift is actually inside our countries, the changing politics and dynamics inside Europe and inside America. And these are partly the consequences of the economic crisis and a result of what I just talked about, the sense that governments can't be trusted with this kind of decisions over security policy making as they might have been before. And this is then tied into the rise of social media, the loss of sort of traditional bases for the traditional parties to operate from, a sense that governments are having to constantly re-earn the legitimacy and the mandate from their voters, even after elections. You know, you don't get elected and then have 4 years to try to implement your platform. You get elected and then you have to keep re-earning your right to govern from then on. And we've seen a sort of decay in those principal parties, the size of the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, the rise of the National Front in France, even with the strong showing by Angela Merkel in the last vote, the decline in the strength of the FDP, of the SPD. Across all of Europe, the major parties are finding their votes slowly being eroded away by smaller protest parties or just by voter apathy. And the problem is those parties were the ones that carried the flag of the transatlantic relationship. Yeah? They might have had different interpretations of it, whether it should be more security-focused or more values-focused, more democracy-focused or more economic development-focused, but ultimately they put the transatlantic relationship in many cases at the heart of the value that they saw. And you could contrast this with each of these protest parties who actually see the United States partly as what they don't want to be. It's interesting that UKIP, the UK Independence Party, that's becoming quite a force, I think, in the UK, is very anti-American. It's not just anti-European. And it's anti-engagement. It's sort of draw up the drawbridge and come back to the island of Britain kind of mentality. And if I can just say one more thing on the UK point, which is important here, the UK is no longer acting as a kind of bridge or as a glue between the United States and Europe. Britain's detached and one could even say uncertain future in Europe makes it a less reliable vehicle for the United States to use as a key bridge between the United States and its other European partners. And as I said a minute ago, this kind of sense that even Britain is pulling back from the kind of security leadership that's traditionally taken. For the UK to have a 19-ship surface navy, yes, 19 ships, 19 frigates and destroyers. And what happened to the Royal Navy? And it's very hard for it to take that kind of leadership role that you'd expect in Europe. And on the US side, obviously you have a Tea Party phenomenon emerging, its own demographic change, much more diverse population from an ethnic standpoint, less linkages to Europe, a greater turn to the Pacific. In any case, I just want to point out that I think this isn't just strategy. This is also culture, character, inside. So what about the future? The last section, you know, purpose, apathy, which one's going to win out? Let me talk in particular about, I suppose, four areas where we could see some strength or not. What about the economic side that I mentioned to you at the beginning? You know, is TTIP going to be the great savior of the transatlantic relationship as I laid out perhaps at the beginning? Well, to be frank, right now, there's some pretty worrying signs. And it's always going to be difficult. I don't think anyone underestimated the extent to which trying to strike a deal in as sensitive an area as standards and regulations that really are not to do with prices of goods, but about what defines whether your citizens should be protected from them or enabled by them. Once you get into these types of issues of safety standards, you really start to move into culture and sovereignty in a way that no transatlantic trade relationship has done before. And I think it's been a particularly difficult time to do this. We're talking about GMOs here, genetically modified organisms. And Europe has a precautionary principle which says we're always very cautious about these things before saying yes. We've picked a moment to try to open up our financial services markets when Europe is trying to create a banking union with all sorts of political deals about bonuses and financial transaction taxes at a time when the US is trying to embed its Dodd-Frank Act. We're trying to create a more open digital market, yes, at a time when the very notion of whether US internet service providers should be allowed to take Europeans' data back to the United States under the safe harbor agreements which were already in place. A time when public procurement is meant to be opened up, but each side is more and more worried about trying to keep its voters happy by making sure they can push public sector contracts towards their own companies. So this is a pretty difficult time to try and break down those barriers. I think two other problems that we have. One is, even since TTIP was launched, there's a growing sense that Europe needs it more than America. Yeah? The US has got its energy revolution coming along, lots of European companies complaining that they can't afford to compete anymore against America, will invest there. Europe's growth still fairly stuttering compared to the United States. You know, for members of Congress, unless we're both in it together, perhaps we can afford to hold off a little bit. And then, of course, you've got the political calendar in the United States, which makes it particularly difficult with the midterms now coming up, TPP not completed yet. But in Europe as well, there's growing popular opposition. I had to do an interview, actually on the Today program on this, on Friday morning. And what was the whole discussion about? Investor-state dispute settlement. Now, I'm not going to bore you. Some of you probably are trade lawyers or work on this stuff, but I have to confess, I'd had to read up about ISDS a little bit over the last while. But this is this latest concern, that somehow US companies are going to break into the European market and go around our courts and be able to force individual European countries to open up maybe their markets to genetically modified organisms, even if the TTIP agreement has kept them on the back burner. So there's a rising popular opposition which is going to be very difficult to overcome. Now, can you still let TTIP fail? I don't know. It's going to be a pretty devastatingly negative thing if this agreement stretches out into a sort of Doha-like limbo. And I wouldn't be surprised if the two sides find a way at some point before the end of President Obama's term to declare victory. And there's an easy way of declaring victory, which is around a few tariff reductions, and then setting up a kind of structure, an infrastructure for regular review of standards and regulations by regulators on each side of the Atlantic, even if it's prospectively for future regulation. Now, this all sounds very technical, I suppose. Why mention it? I mention it because I think it will be particularly important if over the next 4 to 5 to 10 years this does become a new form of institutional dialogue, that regulators, legislators in Europe and America start to become socialized with each other in a constant form of negotiation over where their economic regulation goes. Because this will form a new form of transatlantic structure, much as NATO committees on arms procurement and requirements did during the Cold War. So, you know, basically, I don't think we're going to find a transatlantic split economically. We're too interdependent. As I said, I think the fear of the rise of other competitors is going to be a driver, and I think there's a way out. What about the kind of security alliance, the second part we talked about? Well, look, the withdrawal from Afghanistan is definitely creating some deep concerns about the future of NATO. Already, prior to the Ukraine crisis, there were many NATO members who felt, right, great, NATO's coming back to Europe, we can now focus on Russia, which has remained our threat. For other countries to think, oh my God, no, if NATO comes back to Europe, we're going to focus on Russia, which is not what we want to do. So you had really a growing potential division inside Europe. On balance, I think the Ukraine-Russia developments, at least in the near term, are probably going to re-inject an element of solidarity and focus on defense budgets, on requirements. It probably will tip the balance of NATO to an inward-looking or Europe-focused strategy. And it will probably weaken slightly the partnership model which was being developed. Could NATO draw in Japan, Australia, other countries into a more regular form of interaction? I think President Putin, for all his various reasons, which we can discuss later, is going to end up giving NATO, as a sort of Euro-Atlantic focused alliance, a new shot in the arm. And let's not forget that the Russia-NATO relationship was already in a bit of a downward spiral prior to the Ukraine invasion. So what about a broader space beyond security, the traditional sort of NATO space? Is there room for the United States and Europe to be broader partners in the area of foreign policy? I think there's sort of two areas that could be worth looking at. One is the Middle East, because I think here, as I said, there's an interesting tension between a US that wants to be more selective and a Europe that has no choice but to become more involved in Middle East security and politics. If there is some type of deal on Middle East, in the Arab-Israeli peace process, we may see European troops have to be brought in on the kind of security structures to police such an agreement. If an Iran deal is done of some sort, European governments are going to have to step forward to provide some of the security to Gulf countries. Already we've seen the Brits start to open up a new deal with the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, on a new air base. The French have already built a naval base there as well. There are some commercial interests in doing this as well. But I think we will find Europeans increasingly engaged in a more proactive way in Middle East security, and perhaps sharing the burden a little more effectively with the US. Another area where I think we could see some cooperation is on the civilian side of foreign policy. I was struck when Anne-Marie Slaughter, when she was still head of policy planning in the first Obama term, came and spoke at Chatham House. She said, I'm excited about a vision for the United States as a civilian power. A civilian power, that's what Europe's meant to be, not America. But from certain people in the Obama administration standpoint, and this had some echoes in the Millennium Challenge Corporation that President Bush also pushed through George W. Bush. This idea of development assistance and coordinating conditionality, private sector involvement in Africa in particular, has become a much more sort of ripe area for collaboration. The G7 agenda on more open markets, open procurement, the combating sexual violence against women, there's a kind of civilian, civil power dimension, which I can see the United States and Europe potentially finding much closer collaboration on going forward. The last point I want to bring up, which I won't spend much time on because I could take a lot on it, is internet governance. I think one of the more interesting areas of international affairs in future years. In fact, Chatham House is involved in a global commission on internet governance, which is just being set up right now. And it's fascinating to see the different positions between US government officials and some of the technology sector and European legislators, especially the European Parliament. You know, we're all meant to be part of the multi-stakeholder approach to internet governance, but I think we're really going to find some quite complex divergences between the United States and Europe. But however big those divergences, they won't be as big as those between the United States, Europe, and other countries that would like to see a much more active government presence in governing the internet. So that I don't go on too long and finish on time here, let me conclude by making the following, I suppose, observations. I think the transatlantic relationship resembles more and more the EU. In other words, it's quite good at looking inside. Yeah? We can manage quite effectively our coordination about ourselves, TTIP being a good example, maybe going back to the threats to NATO from Russia. staying with a sort of somewhat inwardly focused agenda, or an agenda that's close to our neighborhood, seems to be a relatively fertile space for Europe and America to keep working on. But the ability of the transatlantic relationship to provide security in a broader global sense, to be a contributor to security beyond its borders, seems to be incredibly difficult to pull off, just as it is for the European Union, which whenever it looks out beyond its borders, seems to see the strength of its coordination start to erode. Ultimately, a United States that's increasingly selective about its foreign policy means that we'll have a transatlantic relationship that's also very selective about what it does and does not get engaged in on the international stage. And I suppose the key challenge we're going to have to face, and stuff that we're working on right now, not just at Chatham House, but I'd say all institutions in Europe and in the United States, is can you keep the structures together for cooperation if your agenda is relatively limited? You know, how strong will NATO be? Can TTIP become something meaningful? Is the G7 going to be able to regain a meaning within a G20 kind of world? And through this period of difficulty, I suppose the rest of the world, whether it be in Asia, Africa, Latin America, wherever, better prepare, I suppose, not just for a United States that's a little less engaged, but a transatlantic relationship that probably isn't going to be contributing that much to global security. So let me finish there.